In this video, I wanted to talk about coalitions, notation, and analyzing these weighted voting systems a little bit further. But actually, before we get into that, I wanted to sort of say, well, what's the eventual goal? What are we trying to figure out in this chapter? Returning back to the idea of power, we're trying to figure out how influential each of those people are. Like returning to the example I was talking about in the previous video, we had a situation with three voters or in the case of the one from the packet, four voters, each with different numbers of votes. And let's say we wanted to know, well, for player one, player two, player three, or player four, how much influence do they have? And what you'd expect without doing any thinking or math would be, okay, player one probably has the most influence because they have the most votes, and player four has the least influence, which is totally correct. It's not necessarily exactly that simple, but that sort of thinking is true. But our goal is to figure out, well, how do we quantify their power, and how do we, assign, say, like a percentage to their number? It's not just done by calculating, well, how many votes do they have divided by the total number of votes in the whole system. Because and that's exactly what we're going to work on. So whenever we're trying to calculate power, don't do that. That's not gonna necessarily make sense. What you'll be doing is calculating, well, what percentage of the vote do they have? But so that's what I wanted to just show you some examples of our eventual goal. And we're going to be focusing on two different methods for determining the outcomes of the power, which are sometimes called the Banzhaf power distribution and the Shapley-Shubik power distribution, which are two different methods of doing the calculation. Kind of like in last chapter, uh, sometimes the answer is not always clear cut. And like with power, there's different ways of determining power and kind of organizing it, and that's the difference between the two methods. But we'll focus on each method separately and kind of review uh, the differences after we get into that detail. But looking at a couple examples of some weighted voting systems, the United States presidential election is actually what we call the electoral college. Is actually, it's not exactly a weighted voting system. It's kind of a combination of a lot of different ideas, but it functions much like a weighted voting system when all is said and done. And if you're not too familiar with how it works in the U.S., basically all of the members, all citizens of the United States vote. Just again, this is just for the president for per se. But everybody votes for their preferred candidate. But the winner is not determined by who has the most votes or any of that. It's actually determined by the Electoral College. And basically, how that works is each state is assigned a particular number of votes. And if you're wondering, well, how do this map shows us how many votes each state gets. And in the case of 2016, I believe this is where the data is from. Yeah, uh, who got those votes, depending on party affiliation. Um, but basically, let's take California for an example, which is pretty much always Democrat and probably will never not be Democrat. Um, but then trying to not. I'm going to try very strongly to avoid all political topics because again we're really trying to focus on the math and not the but we'll try to at least get into some of the issues that arise from the math side of things. But anyways, basically California has 55 votes in the electoral college, and it's sort of like each state submits its final decision. In this case, all of California's votes go towards the Democratic side. And for example, let's say we were to look at Texas. Well, as you can see, Texas has these other ones which is a little bit more complex than it's not exactly a simple weighted voting system, but it's very similar. But let's just take Florida for example. All 29 of their votes went to Trump, whereas all of California's votes went to Clinton. And basically, each state sort of makes its own decision about president, and then all of these votes are submitted and calculated. And once you get to a certain threshold, the quota, which is I think it's 270 or is it 272? I forget off the top of my head. Um, and actually it's in the slide, so I should just hit next. Yeah, it's 270 is the quota for the Electoral College, but whoever gets to 270 votes wins the presidential election. And Trump won in 2016 because he had more votes in the Electoral College. But one thing that happened in 2016, which is a little bit unusual, is actually Hillary Clinton won what we call the popular vote in the United States, which means she actually got more votes. And so if it was just a direct comparison of votes in the United States, there would have been a different outcome. But because we use this weighted voting system, it didn't happen that way. And it's again, voting methods are not very inclined to change because say in the United States we decided, okay, we don't like this system anymore, we want to change it. It's very hard to have that happen because usually if someone wants to change it, it's usually there's some bias in there. Like for example, maybe the Democrats are, um, thinking about changing their uh, wanting to change the electoral system, but the Republicans would not be very happy about that because it's sort of working in their favor in a way. And whenever it favors one party, the other party doesn't want to have it changed. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the good of the country or the good of the system itself. It's more about power and control. And unfortunately, that's like all of what a lot of politics care about. Sorry, I'm getting off topic, and I'm trying to avoid doing so. But anyways, so basically at the end of the day, there's 51 players in the United States because 50 states plus the District of Columbia, and all of those votes go into this big system. And you could imagine actually California is would be the player one because they have the most votes. But even that doesn't necessarily mean California is in control, because they're far from making the quota all by themselves. And also talking about the idea of, well, how do we determine how many votes each state gets? That's a whole nother idea, which is kind of similar to the idea of apportionment, which we're going to get into chapter 4. And actually, there are some issues with the electoral college in apportionment, which actually mean that voters in the United States, they don't actually have an equal weight or of equal say in the electoral college system. So there are some pretty big issues with the system, depending on your perspective, which most people aren't even aware of. But anyways, we'll circle back to this in chapter 4. One other example, just to look at the numbers in a more specific scenario, is the European Union. And I also wanted to talk about what is our end goal. What is this Bonzoff power distribution? What is the Shapley-Shubik power distribution? Like, what is the end goal for what we're trying to mathematically calculate in this chapter? But let's look at the European Union. So here we can see each of the member nations and how many votes they get in their particular system. So, France, Germany, Italy, UK up top, Spain, Poland closely behind, Romania, and so on. And they all have a certain number of votes. And basically what we can see is what percent of the total vote do they have, but also in this column here, there's this collection of numbers which we call their Bonzoff power indices. And basically this is a quantification of how much power each member has. And while you might notice it's fairly similar to the percent of the votes they have, it's not exactly the same. And that's, sort of the issue that we're going to be, uncovering. But basically we're going to be figuring out how do we calculate such things. And, we're not actually going to do it on this quite of a large scale problem, because the math for doing these calculations with 51 states is quite daunting. But anyways, that's kind of what we're going to get into.